Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on the state of the workplace, especially for young men. You sent over a really interesting bunch of articles and research, and it seems like you're really concerned about this great detachment thing, all this apathy and disillusionment among workers.
Yeah, it's not just like some stories you hear. We're seeing the data to back this up. Like Gallup polls are showing that only 31% of U.S. workers feel engaged at work.
31%.
Really?
Yeah, and that's the lowest it's been in 10 years, and it seems like the biggest drop is among those under 35.
Wow, 31%. That's pretty bleak. Okay, so we've got this term quiet quitting, which I think a lot of people have at least heard of. But just to be clear, it's this idea that employees are just doing the minimum at work, just meeting the basic requirements of their jobs, but not really going above and beyond or feeling invested. They aren't quitting outright, but they aren't exactly happy to be there either. Right? It's kind of like passive disengagement. And even though it might seem harmless on the surface, it actually has huge financial implications for businesses. We're talking about decreased productivity, higher turnover rates, and this thing called presenteeism, where people are physically at work, but they've mentally checked out.
Oh yeah, presenteeism. One of the articles had a crazy stat on that. It said that presenteeism costs the U.S. economy an estimated $150 billion a year, like this silent productivity drain.
It is. And replacing an employee who quits can cost a company from 50% to 150% of their annual salary. So from a purely financial perspective, businesses have a big reason to fix this.
It's not all about the money, though, is it? There's a human cost to all of this. The articles you sent talked a lot about burnout. And we're not just talking about feeling a bit stressed. We're talking about chronic exhaustion, cynicism, and a feeling of being detached from work that can really mess with people's mental and physical health.
Absolutely. And to really get how bad burnout is, it helps to look at a framework like Maslow's burnout inventory. It breaks it down into three parts: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment. When someone's got all three, that's a sign of serious burnout. It needs to be addressed.
Okay, so we've got declining engagement, quiet quitting, presenteeism, burnout. It's not a pretty picture of workplaces these days, but the big question is why? Why are so many people, especially younger guys, feeling so detached and disillusioned with work?
Well, the sources point to a few things. Economic anxiety is a big one. Inflation and the rising cost of living are putting a lot of pressure on people. And it's hard to get motivated at work when you can barely pay your bills, especially when you feel like you're working hard but not getting anywhere.
One article said something like, work is pointless when the money you get paid has no value. And they even said something about eggs being $50 for a 30-pack. That might be exaggerating a bit, but I think it gets across that very real feeling that wages haven't kept up with how expensive everything is.
It does. And this money problem ties into another factor: feeling like work has no meaning. If you're working your butt off, but not seeing real progress in your life, if you can't afford a decent place to live, or even just the basics, then it's easy to feel like work itself is meaningless, like you're just spinning your wheels.
It makes me think of that story from one of the articles about the 35-year-old investment banker who died of a heart attack after working 100-hour weeks. Talk about no work-life balance.
That story really got to me too. It's a sad example of the worst kind of burnout. And while some companies, especially in finance, are trying to fix this by putting limits on how many hours people can work each week, a lot of people doubt that'll really change anything.
Yeah, one article was super cynical about that. They basically said it's just for show, a way for companies to look like they're doing something without dealing with the bigger cultural problems.
There's a feeling that these initiatives are more about protecting the company's image than actually trying to make things better for employees.
It makes you wonder if this is a management problem. One stat that really stood out to me was that only 31% of managers themselves feel engaged at work. That's the same as the overall workforce.
That's a good point. Is bad management a cause of this widespread disengagement, or is it a symptom of a larger issue? It's kind of a chicken and egg situation.
Maybe a bit of both. But it shows that we need leadership training that focuses on recognizing and dealing with burnout. Not just offering stuff like yoga classes and meditation apps, but building a workplace culture where people feel like they can talk about their problems without getting in trouble.
I totally agree. And this is where things get even more interesting, because some of the articles you sent bring up something I hadn't really thought about before: how things happening in society are affecting workplace detachment, especially for young men.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. One of the sources actually argues that young men having fewer chances to find relationships might be playing a part in this whole great detachment thing.
The argument is that if men aren't feeling successful in their personal lives, if they're feeling alone, and like they don't have a purpose outside of work, then that can definitely affect their work lives too.
So it's not just about what's going on at work. It's about young men feeling disillusioned with their lives in general.
Exactly. And this connects to the bigger conversation happening right now about the gender war and how the tension between men and women might be affecting how well society functions. It's a complicated issue that we need to discuss carefully.
Well, we've got a lot to unpack. We've touched on money worries, feeling like work has no meaning, the impact of working remotely, and now this whole gender dynamics angle. It seems like what's happening in the workplace reflects all the big social and economic forces happening in society.
It does. And it's important to remember that the workplace isn't some separate thing. It's all connected.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the main problems, but what about solutions? Do these articles offer any hope?
They do mention some possible solutions. Things like employee assistance programs, mental health resources, better leadership training. But there's also a lot of doubt about whether corporations are really serious about fixing these problems.
Yeah, one article was pretty cynical about it. They said a lot of these company wellness initiatives are just for show, designed to protect their profits and keep employees from complaining. They even suggested that employees should mess with those satisfaction surveys to get their point across.
That's an interesting suggestion, for sure. And it shows how frustrated a lot of employees are feeling.
We've got declining engagement, economic anxieties, a possible mental health crisis brewing, and it's costing businesses billions of dollars. Seems like everyone should want to find real solutions, but then there's this doubt about whether the people in charge are actually going to make meaningful changes.
It's a valid concern. And it brings up the
Okay.
question, if we can't count on companies to fix this, then what? What do we do?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one we'll keep exploring as we go deeper into these articles. But first, let's take a closer look at this whole remote work paradox. It's often seen as a way to help with burnout, but like your articles pointed out, it might actually be making the problem worse in some ways.
It's interesting how remote work has become this kind of double-edged sword. On the one hand, you've got the flexibility and the autonomy, and people really seem to want that. One of the articles actually said that 90% of office workers don't want to go back to the office full time.
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to skip the commute and work in their PJs, right? But then you have the other side of it, feeling isolated and disconnected from your coworkers and like what the company is all about.
Exactly. And it's not just a feeling. There was another article that talked about this Gallup study, and they found that people who worked fully remotely were actually more likely to say they felt disconnected from their company's mission compared to people who worked on-site or did that hybrid thing.
It makes sense, though, when you think about it. Those quick chats by the coffee machine or those brainstorming sessions that just happen when everyone's in the same room, those little things can really build that sense of community and like everyone's working towards the same goal.
They do. And that sense of belonging is really important for people to be engaged and happy at work. It's something companies need to put more effort into, especially with all this remote and hybrid work going on.
So it's not just about giving people the tech and the tools to work remotely. It's also about creating a space online where people can connect personally and feel like they're part of a team.
Right. It might mean doing more of those virtual team building activities or having regular check-ins that aren't just about work tasks, or even finding ways for everyone to get together in person, even if it's just once or twice a year.
You know, one article had this interesting idea that all this back and forth about remote work is actually a sign of a bigger societal issue, this thing called future shock.
Oh yeah, future shock. That's a term from way back in the 70s. This guy, Alvin Toffler, he said that we're seeing so much change happening so fast with technology and money and just like society that it's kind of freaking people out.
And that feeling of constantly being on edge and things changing all the time can make it hard to feel settled, both in your personal life and at work.
It can. It's like the ground is always shifting under your feet.
Yeah.
And that can lead to feeling anxious and unstable, which makes it hard to get motivated or feel engaged no matter where you're working.
So it's not just about getting tired of Zoom calls or missing out on the office gossip. It's about this deeper feeling of unease that a lot of people have with everything changing so quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And that unease can show up in different ways, burnout being one of them.
We talked about burnout before, but I think it's worth mentioning again because it's such a widespread issue, and it's really at the core of this whole Great Detachment thing.
It is. And it's important to remember that burnout isn't just feeling stressed out or working too much. It's this constant state of exhaustion that can really affect your physical and mental health.
One of the articles even said burnout can lead to things like insomnia, heart disease, depression, even suicidal thoughts. It's serious stuff.
It is. The World Health Organization actually recognizes burnout as a real occupational phenomenon. They define it as a syndrome that comes from chronic workplace stress that hasn't been managed well.
Wow, so it's like an official thing now, and I think so many people are dealing with it maybe without even knowing it.
I think you're right, and that's why it's so important to talk about it, to make it okay to talk about it, and to help people recognize the signs so they can get help if they need it.
For sure. And on a more practical level, companies need to be doing more to address burnout in the workplace, not just offering those temporary fixes, but making real changes to create a more supportive and sustainable work environment.
I completely agree. It's not just about being nice to employees. It's about understanding that burnout is a real problem that costs businesses money and hurts their employees.
You mentioned before that replacing an employee can cost a company up to 150% of their salary. Plus, you have the lost productivity from presenteeism, those employees who are there but not really mentally present.
Exactly. And then you add in the healthcare costs from all the illnesses linked to burnout, and it becomes pretty clear that companies can't just ignore this.
So if we all agree that burnout is bad for employees and bad for businesses, then what are some concrete things companies can do to fix it?
Well, some of the ideas that came up in your articles were things like employee assistance programs, which can offer counseling, stress management, and other support.
Those sound helpful, but one of your sources was pretty doubtful about whether those programs actually work.
Yeah, that's a fair point. These programs are only as good as the resources and support they provide. And there's also that stigma. A lot of people don't want to use these services because they're afraid of looking weak or like they can't handle things.
Right, there's still a lot of shame around mental health, especially at work.
There is. And that needs to change. We need workplaces where it's okay to not be okay, where people feel comfortable talking about their struggles and asking for help.
Definitely. It's not just about having resources, it's about building a supportive environment.
Exactly. And that means training managers to recognize when someone is burning out, to talk openly and honestly with their employees about how they're doing, and to create a work environment where people feel valued and respected.
So it's not just about spending money on the problem, it's about creating a workplace culture that puts employee well-being first.
It is. And that's where leadership is so important.
One article was pretty insistent that this whole issue of people detaching from work and burning out is really a management problem.
And there's some truth to that. Managers set the tone for the whole team. If they're overworked, stressed, and disengaged, it's going to affect everyone below them.
It's like that saying, the fish rocks from the head down.
Exactly. So companies need to invest in training their leaders, not just on the technical stuff, but on things like emotional intelligence, empathy, and the ability to create a positive work environment.
And that goes back to something we talked about before, recognizing and dealing with burnout in managers themselves. Because if managers are burnt out, they can't really support their teams.
Exactly. It's like they say on airplanes, put your own oxygen mask on before helping others. Managers have to take care of themselves if they want to be good leaders.
Okay, so better training for leaders is part of the solution. But what about those bigger societal trends we talked about earlier? The economic anxieties, that feeling of meaninglessness, and this whole gender war thing. How do we deal with those?
Those are big, complicated issues, and there's no easy answer. But I think the first step is just admitting that they exist, starting to have honest conversations about them, and realizing that they're affecting the workplace, whether we like it or not.
We can't just pretend that what's happening outside work isn't affecting how people feel about their jobs.
Exactly. One of the articles made a really good point about this. They said that the biggest potential for productivity in our society comes from men between 20 and 35.
That's the group we've been talking about a lot today. Young men who are feeling detached, disillusioned, and burnt out.
Right. And this article said that we can't afford to have these guys feeling alienated and disengaged. They said, and I'm quoting here, you cannot have 3/4 of that population be invisible to the opposite sex. That doesn't work.
It's definitely a strong statement, but I think it shows that we need to create a society where young people, both men and women, feel valued, supported, and connected. If they don't, it's going to affect everything in our society, including the workplace.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point. This isn't just about work. We're talking about building a society that takes care of everyone, a society where people feel like they belong, where they can find love and connection, and where their work actually has a purpose.
Those are some big goals, but I think it's important to have that vision, to aim for something better.
I agree. And I think one of the things your sources did well was to make us think critically about how things are now, to question what we believe about work and what it means to have a good life.
Yeah, one article said something like, work is totally pointless in a system where the money you get paid has no value. It's a pretty depressing thought, but it makes you think.
It does. And it comes back to that idea of finding meaning and purpose, both in our jobs and in our lives outside of work.
We've talked about a lot of problems today, and it can feel overwhelming. But it's important to remember that we're not helpless. We can make choices, both as individuals and as a society, to create a better way of working and living.
Absolutely. One thing individuals can do is to start questioning the messages they're getting from companies, from the media, from society as a whole.
What do you mean by that?
Well, one article was pretty harsh about those corporate wellness initiatives, suggesting they're just a way to keep employees happy enough to keep working.
They even said employees should sabotage those satisfaction surveys to get their point across.
I'm not saying I agree with that, but I do think it's important to be skeptical of these things and ask ourselves, are these programs really designed to help us, or are they just a way for companies to look good?
So it's about being aware that companies might be trying to manipulate us and not just believing everything they say.
Right. And it's about being willing to challenge the way things are and demand better.
I think that's a good place to pause this conversation for now. We've covered a lot, and we've brought up some really important questions.
We have.
Uh,
And in the last part of our deep dive, we'll explore those questions further and see what your sources say about creating a more fulfilling and sustainable way of working.
okay, so we've talked about all these huge systemic problems impacting workplaces, economic anxiety, burnout, that feeling of meaninglessness, and how those typical solutions like company wellness programs might not be cutting it. But where do we go from here? What are some other ways to create a work environment that's both productive and actually good for people?
Well, one of your sources was saying that real change has to happen at a societal level. Like we need to rethink our whole relationship with work and what it even means to have a good life.
It's like we've been told that work should be our main source of meaning and purpose, and now a lot of people feel lost and kind of empty when their jobs don't live up to that.
It's a good point. And it fits with this growing trend of people looking for different career paths, starting their own businesses, or just prioritizing experiences and relationships over traditional ideas of success.
Yeah, one of the sources actually used the term downshifting for this trend, where people are choosing to work less, earn less, and focus on stuff they actually enjoy outside of their jobs.
Right, and I think that shows people are starting to realize that work-life balance isn't just about finding time for fun stuff. It's about building a life where work fits in a way that's healthy and you can keep doing it.
It's about finding that balance where work makes your life better instead of taking over.
Exactly. And that could mean setting boundaries, being pickier about the work you do, or even talking to your boss about more flexible work arrangements.
Speaking of flexibility, another possible solution that came up was this idea of a universal basic income, or UBI.
UBI is an interesting idea. It's basically like everyone gets a guaranteed income, no matter if they have a job or not. The thinking is that it would help people who are struggling financially and let them follow their passions, start businesses, or just take some time off without worrying about money.
One article argued that UBI could be a game changer, especially for young people dealing with the tough job market and student loans. They said it could give them the freedom to try out different careers and find work that's actually meaningful to them.
It's a strong argument. Of course, there are worries about how much it would cost and how to actually make it work. But I think it's a discussion worth having as we think about what a fairer and more sustainable future of work could look like.
It's almost like we need to stop focusing on fixing individuals and start creating a system that supports everyone.
I think that's a really smart observation. And it goes back to this idea of sharing responsibility, realizing that we're all connected and that how well we do individually depends on how well our communities and society are doing as a whole.
And that brings us back to the gender dynamics we were talking about before. One source made a pretty bold statement saying that we can't have a healthy society if a big chunk of the population, in this case, young men, is feeling alienated and disconnected.
And they connected that feeling of alienation to the problems a lot of young men are having with dating and relationships.
They were arguing that if men aren't feeling good about their personal lives, if they're lonely and don't feel like they have a purpose outside of work, it's going to affect their motivation and how they engage in all parts of their lives, including work.
It's a complicated issue, and there's no easy answer. But I think it shows how important it is to address these bigger societal problems if we want to have workplaces where everyone can do well.
So it's not just about offering better benefits or flexible work schedules. It's about creating a society where people feel valued, connected, and like they have a good future ahead of them.
Exactly. It's about encouraging that sense of belonging and purpose that goes beyond just the workplace.
One source had a really interesting quote about this. They said, "The greatest potential productivity in your society is men aged 20 to 35. You cannot have three-quarters of that population be invisible to the opposite sex. That doesn't work."
It's a thought-provoking statement, but I think it gets to the heart of it. We need to build a society where young people, men and women, feel seen, heard, and supported. A society where they feel like they have a chance to build a good life.
And that means dealing with things like economic inequality, loneliness, and the lack of meaning and purpose that so many people are dealing with.
It does. And it's a big task,
Yeah.
but I think it's a challenge we need to take on.
So, to wrap things up, we've explored some really complex and tough issues today. We've talked about the problems with work as it is now, the possible solutions, and the bigger trends in society that are contributing to this feeling of detachment and disillusionment that many people are experiencing.
We've touched on money worries, burnout, the search for meaning and purpose, the impact of working from home, and those complicated dynamics between men and women today.
It's a lot to take in, and it can feel kind of overwhelming. But we hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about, some new ways of looking at things, and maybe even inspired you to do something about it.
Remember, the future of work isn't set in stone. We're creating it together through the choices we make, the actions we take, and the conversations we have.
So keep thinking about these issues, keep questioning the way things are, and keep pushing for a better world.
Because a better world is possible.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working towards a more fulfilling and sustainable future of work.